Before we can even begin to talk about different representations of witches on screen, in literature, and in art, and how they differ from each other and what they have to actually say about witches, we first have to define what a witch is, and the different types of witches and witchcraft that can commonly be found in different forms of media. The word witch is a broad one that can mean very different things and call upon very different imagery based on the context and time in which it is used. And this has caused a lot of problems in the past. One prominent example in recent memory being the book burnings during the Harry Potter craze of the 90s and early 2000s, when some readers drew similarities between J.K. Rowling's generic-style witches to the biblical satanic witches from the purges of the 1500s, casting her words into the fire just as their ancestors had done with supposed heretics. Merriam-Webster defines a witch as one that is credited with usually malignant supernatural powers, especially a woman practicing usually black witchcraft, often with the aid of a devil or familiar. Now, in my opinion, this definition has some issues, and we're going to get to that. But for now, it works well enough as a frame to allow us to go over the most frequently occurring types of witches in media. Probably the most common type of witch that you can find in film and other media is the satanic witch, which you could also find being referred to as a biblical witch or an Abrahamic witch, who derives their powers from a direct sexual relationship with Satan, like the witches in Rosemary's Baby or Hocus Pocus. These are the Salem witch trial brand of witches that were actually put to death in real life. There's the sword and shield high fantasy witch that was most common in the 1980s, and appeared in works like The Sword and the Sorcerer, Sorceress, The Lord of the Rings, Troll, Berserk, The Black Cauldron, Fire and Ice, and Dead Time stories. The source of their magic is typically not very well explained, and are the least based in reality out of all of the witches. It is most common here also to find male witches out of all of these subcategories, often referred to as wizards, warlocks, magi, conjurers, magicians, or sorcerers. They may be part animal, frequently are nude, usually are accompanied by some sort of ancient magical object, and are common still in many video games, television shows, tabletop games such as Dungeons & Dragons, and card games like Magic the Gathering. There's the pagan witch, also known as the traditional witch or natural witch, like those featured in Midsummer, Halloween 3, The Love Witch, The Craft, and Apostle. And here I should say that I'm not talking about real-life Wicca or neo-pagan witches, but more so the idea that has formed about them in media that over time has combined with the ideas taken from early Middle-Age pagans as well from different regions of Europe. These types of witches frequently gain their power from nature and are very nature-based in everything that they do, and aren't tied to anything that we would commonly associate with Abrahamic religions for the most part, except for the occasional worship of a horned god. They also might gain their powers from within by using their willpower, similar to the teachings of the early 1900s witch Aleister Crowley, or through the emotions that are tied to specific acts such as sex, violence, or crying. These types of witches may use potions from herbs, period blood, other bodily fluids, or even hair, and may celebrate solstices, read tarot cards, burn candles, dance in rituals, and study the stars. Their power is in the earth, and everything that they do brings humanity back to its basic forms in nature. These types of witches, when presented in media, also do not have to be evil per se, and in fact they are usually presented as neutral as opposed to straight good or evil.
True magic is neither black nor white. It's both because nature is both, loving and cruel, all at the same time.
The pagan-style witch is probably the most wide and difficult category to define, because it contains so many different concepts and ideologies within it, from many different real places and time periods in world history, such as the Thelemists, Wiccans, Pagans, Santeros, Neo-Pagans, Voodoo, Druids, Strigaria, folk witches, and other nature-based styles of witchcraft across different pieces of media in different decades. Then there is the plain generic witch, that has been most often used in children's media like Snow White, Harry Potter, Wizard of Oz, most of Miyazaki's work, The Witches, or Halloween Town. These witches are usually very much in line with the Christian witches, just more toned down and not aligned with Satan. Their basis in magic is rarely explained, and it often isn't brought up where they get their powers from. Hereditary witches are common here also, passing their magic down through their family line, like the witches in Harry Potter, Kiki's Delivery Service, and Teen Witch. They are just witches and have no familiars or demons that they call upon for power. They are just powerful and need no explanation for the story to function. Almost kind of like a sister species to regular humans. If they are evil, then they tend to be more evil in a generic sense as opposed to evil in a direct satanic sense as well. But the imagery is still pretty similar between the two. And a lot of the time, like in Halloween Town, Harry Potter, or Kiki's Delivery Service, the witch isn't actually evil at all. And these four categories honestly are a little bit too vague and could be narrowed down even more if we worked on it a bit further, but for our purposes in this series, they will work. The word witch can be used in many different ways for different things, too many things even. This is sometimes even brought up within stories about witches, such as in The Craft, where Sarah gets confused to learn that her new friends don't worship Satan, because they are instead pagan-style witches but still have very real magic. It also does not help that in all forms of media, the lines between these four styles of witchcraft can be blurred quite extensively, where creators will pick and choose different aspects that they like from different categories to support the needs of their stories. So the question of what exactly is a witch is a complicated one to answer. It can be a term of self-empowerment that one uses for themselves. It can be a way of life. It can be an insult that at one time was powerful enough to result in death. The long history of the word means that the connotation that it is used in could bring about a host of different ideas and images from different times in the past 1,000 years. So I think to figure out where our current primary notions of witches originates from, we have to turn back to the time of the 1200s to see the origins of the witch purges that would eventually begin fully in the late Middle Ages. As the Catholic Church began to spread their reach in the first 1,000 years of their existence, they inevitably incorporated practitioners of different pagan folk religions into their fold. And a lot of these rural, mostly unpopulated areas still held on to their old traditions and ways of doing things well after joining the church. May Queens were still celebrated, but now instead of praising different nature deities such as Floralia, the goddess of flowers, they now worshipped Mary. Pagan rituals were still practiced as tradition, and magic was not yet seen as heretical, but instead only as a folk remnant of a time gone by. That was until the Inquisition, that started in the 1250s, and was designed to root out heretics that threatened the future existence of the church. We like to think of Catholics and later Protestants as being witch crazy, and it's true that for a time they were. But for roughly the period of the first 1300 years of the church, witches were not really seen as a major part of Christian theology. There are only 13 instances in the Bible that the word witchcraft is used directly, and most of them are not gendered uses of the word. 2 of the verses are in references to male witches, and 3 of them are in reference to female witches. So it is clear that witches were a part of the faith and belief system of Abrahamic religions, but in a minor part that up until the 1400s did not have a role in day-to-day life. Witches in this early period were really undefined, as they were usually in most texts not specifically gendered, and they were only vague references to different types of sorcerers, healers, magicians, and other practitioners of witchcraft that mostly left the details to the imagination of the reader or listener. The Canon Episcopi in the year 906 was a Catholic document that even declared witchcraft as a fantasy, saying that pagan traditions practiced by those who lived in rural areas of the Holy Roman Empire were merely that, traditions, and that they should not be seen as either valid to Christian faith and theology or heresy, but more so just a part of the rich cultural histories that were passed down through families for generations. As a result of this, witches were punished under civil law instead of ecclesiastical law, meaning that they could not be tried for heresy, which was punishable by death at the time. Magic in this time was also separated into 2 categories, white magic and black magic. White magic, which consisted largely of healing and divination, was not a crime at all, while black magic that consisted of spells intended to harm people were punished by fines, imprisonment, and banishment, but not death. White magic was seen by most as beneficial and was defended by the general public for its uses, but white magic could have been tried as black magic if the spell resulted in a death. By the time of the 1400s, these 2 categories will have disappeared entirely, and both types of magic would be tried as heresy across all of Europe. The first major incident that would eventually lead to the witch purges came in the form of a papal bull of Alexander IV in 1258, which declared that the inquisition of heresy crimes involving magic should be left up to local authorities unless they had proof that manifest heresy was involved in the crime, such as praying to false idols, offering sacrifices, or consulting with demons. It was with this that the prospects of eventual witch trials gained their first legal footing. Before the Black Plague of the mid-1300s, women actually held a higher, more equal standing in most European societies than we like to imagine. In England, for instance, women actually had stronger laws protecting their inheritance than men did. And even though the sexes were not equal, they also largely at the same time did not have the patriarchal makeup that the late Middle Ages would come to have. But as the Catholic Church began to restrict the previous customs and ceremonies that were not strictly based in Christianity, that they had previously ignored from those who descended from pagans, women from these pagan origins would have to start gathering in secret at night to trade their wisdom of the old ways amongst each other. Before the plague, hag was considered a compliment. It was an honor for a woman to reach an old age, as older women were seen as wise and knowledgeable in medicine and were important figures in the survival of a community. But after the plague, people looked for a source to blame, and those involved with medicine and health who lived alone at the edge of town were now seen as suspicious of making people sick. And the word witch began to be used to pass guilt for the plague onto these healers and healthcare workers. Masks of shame started to be strapped to the heads of women accused, and the process of investigating these crimes started to become more and more barbaric. But the horrific progress of investigating witches was slow. Some were executed for their crimes, but for the most part, Alexander IV's bull from 1258 was respected, and women's rights were still protected under it. As under local courts, witches were jailed for some time or tortured and then released, but not put to death. People grew tired of what was viewed as relaxed actions that local courts took against Malefica, and tensions grew among the commons until one day in France, the suspected witch, Joan of Arc, was burned at the stake in 1431. And it was off to the races from there, as this began the new era, now known by neo-pagan witches as the Burning Times. For the most part, everything we commonly think of surrounding most types of witches comes from this book, the Malleus Maleficarum, also known as the Hammer of Witches or the Witch Hunter's Bible. It is the single most important historical document on witchcraft from this early period, and one of the most impactful books on human history ever written. It set up the doctrine that made up the common beliefs about witches within the Catholic faith, and was directly responsible for the witch purges of Europe that raged for hundreds of years. Written in 1486 by Heinrich Kramer, a German churchman and member of the Inquisition, it was intended to stand as the Catholic Church's official view on the concept of witches and witchcraft, in which Kramer lays out the definition of what a witch is, what powers are at the disposal of a witch, and the legal proceedings that communities should take when capturing, trying, and executing witches. It was the second most circulated book in the world for roughly 300 years. Intended originally for Germanic audiences, the book's impact was felt massively in France and Italy, causing untold casualties, and to a lesser extent in England, where witchcraft was considered more of a civil crime for most of the purges, and was punished in secular courts. The book was later adopted by Protestants in both civil and ecclesiastical courts, and led to the death of hundreds of thousands of people over a 300-year campaign. The book is also aggressively misogynistic, at one point saying, "What else is a woman but a foe to friendship, an inescapable punishment, a necessary evil, a natural temptation, a desirable calamity, a domestic danger, a delectable detriment, an evil of nature painted in her fair colors. Therefore, if it be a sin to divorce her when she ought to be kept, it is indeed a necessary torture. For either we commit adultery by divorcing her, or we must endure her daily strife." And so, even though in the early church history witches and magic users could be both men and women, starting with the publication of this book, people accused of witchcraft were almost exclusively women from here on. The main message of the text is clearly advocating for the complete and utter extermination of witches, and by that, Kramer meant women. There is no argument against that. He does not try to hide this in the text, it is very clear what he means when reading it. English clergyman Montague Summers would later say in the early 1900s, while translating the book into modern English for the first time, that it was among the most important, wisest, and weightiest books in the world. Very little is known about the early life of Heinrich Kramer, but in 1476 he began his career as being appointed to the Inquisition, with the job of seeking out heretics and enemies of the church in the areas of Tyrol, Bohemia, Salzburg, and Moravia, and became very well respected for his work. He was also known as an elegant speaker, and was very well educated in history and theology, and was high in the command of the church, answering only to the Archbishop of Salzburg, the Pope, and to God. Using his knowledge of literature in 1484, he invoked Aristotle, St. Augustine, and St. Thomas Aquinas, as a means to validate his new views on wanting to prosecute witchcraft within the Inquisition, which, as I said before, had been left to local courts in almost all cases. Using Exodus 22:18, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," as his primary reasoning to defend his position. The local courts in the area that is now Germany protested this, as they felt that he was going against the papal bull of 1258 and imposing on their legal jurisdiction. As a reaction to this, Kramer went back to Rome and positioned to the Pope at the time, Innocent VIII, what he wanted to do, who agreed with him. And as such, he released a new bull, the Summus Desiderantes Effectibus, which nullified the bull of 1258 and declared the existence of witches as heretics, and explicitly granted authority to the Inquisition to hunt and prosecute them in whatever manner they saw fit. Kramer returned emboldened with power to Germany, where he was seen as an outsider and a man who played dirty politics, with skewed interpretations of scripture to do what he wanted. And it is here where the events surrounding a woman named Helena Schuberin began the campaign of the European witch trials. Within the first few weeks in the city of Innsbruck, Heinrich Kramer was coming down the sidewalk and happened to pass Helena on the way to where he was going. She spit on him and said, "Fie on you, you bad monk. May the falling evil take you." Earlier in the week, she had interrupted one of his sermons, standing in the crowd and yelling that she believed him to be an evil man who aligned with the devil. It would later come about during her trial that she had not been attending most of his mandatory sermons, and had told her friends not to go as well. Kramer had her, along with 13 other citizens, arrested, and the first of this new era of trials began. She was not an average woman, though. She was married to a man named Sebastian, who was a burgher or member of the wealthy bourgeoisie, and her arrest gathered the attention of Bishop George Golser, who had jurisdiction over Innsbruck, who decided to attend the trials. Golser found Kramer's use of torture to gain confessions not to be logical. He found him frequently falsifying records to match his arguments better and to gaslight people, and to presume much that had not actually been proved. He did not condone Kramer's obsession over Helena's sexuality, which he brought up consistently during her trial, asking question after question again and again about her sexual history when it did not pertain to what they were talking about. Golser eventually had enough, and in 1486, he went against the orders of the Pope and ended the trials before they were completed. And after exchanging several unsuccessful letters with Kramer, he publicly demanded him to leave the district and never return. And after a time, Kramer did indeed comply with Golser and left the city. But out of his narcissism, in response to his expulsion and rejection from Innsbruck, Kramer began to write the Malleus Maleficarum, and published it the next year, including Innocent VIII's papal bull as an insert into the front of the book that declared him to have the authority to hunt witches in any way that he deemed necessary. As a result of the book being so widely read and known by priests, scholars, and nobles in different countries, this work alone, granted by the authority of the Pope, started the period of the vicious witch trials that continues in some places to this day. And the 100 years after its publication, the minimum estimate is that 50,000 people were burned alive as suspected witches. And since 2005, at least 3,000 people have been killed in Tanzania for the same reason. It is a problem that was mostly born here that has never fully gone away since its inception. And so, if you trace all of this back to this book, then it is clear to me at least that Heinrich Kramer is directly responsible for the deaths and persecution of an untold amount of people, most of them women, that has continued for hundreds of years past his own death. This book alone is a symbol that words based around fear and the unknown truly do have power. But what does it really say about witchcraft? The words that Kramer used are chilling in the ways that he describes the different courts that he led against women. And the way that he lays out his arguments is methodical, but at the same time based in false logic, as he uses his education to design a way to maximize his effectiveness in exterminating as many people as he could. The text begins with the line, "Whether the belief that there are such beings as witches is so essential a part of the Catholic faith that obstinately to maintain the opposite opinion manifestly savors of heresy." This was intended as a direct threat to the reader, as he is implying that to get in the way of his campaign as George Golser had done the previous year is on the same level as being a witch, and could be punished as heresy. He is maintaining with this first line that his opinions on theology is the new law, and that he had the backing of the current pope to make that so. and the connotations of the sentence would have been terrifying to a well-educated person of the time who did not agree with him. The language that he uses is also purposefully confusing throughout most of the text. He had a masterful use of communication and would frequently have grammatically correct sentences that went on for 60 or 70 words at a time, that were full of complicated legal ideas that would call back to different theological concepts that were centuries old even at the time. By seeming more intelligent through this and invoking famous dead scholars in his work, and by having the Pope in his pocket, it gave him the appearance of being correct in everything that he said, and that ended up being extremely dangerous. In the text, Kramer goes on first to describe how a person goes about becoming a witch. He describes a detailed process of the affair, in which he says that 3 commencements were necessary: the temptation of the devil, the willingness of the tempted, and the permission of God. The third part being there because of free will, because to them, if God did not want there to be witches, then there would be no witches. But from their point of view, God favored the right to choose one's actions and choices on earth, and in doing that gave permission for witches to swear allegiance to the devil if they so choose, with the knowledge that this action would result in damnation and hellfire. In the text, Kramer tries to stoke fear of the ever-growing spread of witches, saying that, in times long past, the incubus devils used to infest women against their wills, but modern witches willingly embrace this most foul and miserable servitude. A woman would sign her name into the devil's book to complete their pact. The devil also in this is said at the beginning of each Black Mass to demand a kiss of shame, or osculum infame, where a witch would begin the Black Sabbath by kissing his second face that was located where his anus should be. It was seen as a profane act of homage, and became a frequent topic of discussion during most witch trials. A man named W. Wright wrote of this in his document, News from Scotland declaring the damnable life of Dr. Fian in 1592. Seeing that they tarried long, he at their coming enjoined them all to a penance, which was that they should kiss his buttocks as a sign of duty to him, which being put over the pulpit bare, everyone did as he had enjoined them. The book lists the powers of witches that they gain from the devil as follows: teleportation, birthing the spawn of demons with the help of incubi, preventing men from getting erections, and causing sterility and infertility to stop them from having children, causing the penis of a man to fall off or shorten the penis to spite him. Witches can change men into the shape of beasts. They can assist with demonic possessions and obsessions. They can cause sickness and disease and infestations. They can pose as midwives and kill children and use their bodies in potions and ointments. They can injure cattle from great distances. They can raise hailstorms and tempests to damage property. And they can strike men and animals with lightning. These rules that Kramer lists are designed to be able to punish as many women as he could, as a lot of them are based around the medical jobs that women would have predominantly held at the time, and others are based around accidents of fate that allowed false guilt to be placed forcefully onto innocent women. Unmarried spinsters were frequently the target of these attacks, and marriage became a stronger tool that the church could use to control women under the new laws of the Malleus Maleficarum. Several other beliefs about witches would enter the lore here around this time that aren't mentioned directly in the Malleus or aren't built much up in the Malleus, but would become common vernacular during the subsequent trials that would be associated with witches today. Objects that witches owned are not mentioned much within the Malleus, but would soon become an obsession for most ecclesiastical judges in courts all over Europe, as well as within rumors that spread among common people. Rings, wands, staves, cups, coins, gold, silver, and other metals, as well as talisman-like objects, were figured to be able to contain powers for witches within them, but specific lore about these rules were not very well developed. Grimoires, or Books of Shadows, were said to contain the notes of witches in her successes of black magic, as a sort of self-made instruction manual on the effectiveness of different types of spells. It was common for grimoires to be falsely made or planted as evidence in the homes of women to make convictions easier to procure. Later on in the Victorian era, grimoires became a fun novelty item to collect that claimed to publish dark and ancient forbidden secrets. Several famous grimoires include the Key of Solomon, the Book of Solomon, Grimorium Verum, Grimoire of Honorius, the Book of Sacred Magic of Abra Malin in the Mage, the Book of Black Magic and Pax, the Secrets of Secrets, the Grand Grimoire, Red Dragon, the Magus, the Black Pulet, Verus Jezetarum Libellus, the Book of Abon, and of course, the Necronomicon. Familiars were also a common association of witches in courts. minor demons that would take the shape of animals that acted as a go-between for the witch and the devil. They most often took the shape of toads, cats, or owls, but could also be rats, bats, insects, or dogs. This is where the fear of the black cat originates, that would become popular in media later on, as black was the color of the devil and cats were said to be the favored form of a familiar to take. Familiars also were frequently named by the witch, which would make sense because most of them were actually just common pets. The Malleus mentions several familiars by name, including 3 toads named Pygon, Tom, and Robin. In some places, if a woman was placed in prison, guards would watch her in shifts for 24 hours a day to see if a familiar in the form of an insect would visit her. There is evidence that flies in a courtroom would have been enough to burn a witch out of fear that they were relaying Satan's messages to her. It did not help that there was scripture to back up this concept, as Leviticus 27 reads, "A man also, or woman, that hath a familiar spirit, or that is a wizard, shall surely be put to death. They shall stone them with stones, their blood shall be upon them." Athames were also common belief to have been used in different types of ceremonies by witches, always double-bladed with a black hilt made of magnetic materials. The Malleus does mention that witches have the ability to fly, but says that ointments cause this, and only mentions broomsticks once directly, as at one point he says that a witch rubs one with an ointment made of a child to make it fly. But today we commonly associate witches as flying on broomsticks, and this didn't happen immediately within the purges, but instead slowly grew with time. And in fact, the story of how brooms came into the picture is kind of an interesting one, because it is one of the few examples of a scholar at the time being brave enough to oppose the culture that agreed with the ideas that were slowly formulating about witches. Guillaume Edeline was a French prior, an Augustine, and a doctor of divinity, which essentially means that he was about as well educated as a person could have been at the time. And in 1453, he publicly said that it was impossible for witches to exist, and that the devil could form no pact or contracts with humans. He was arrested for this, and tortured for days, until he finally confessed that he signed the devil's book, had slept with the devil who had come to him in the form of a sheep to satisfy himself sexually, that he had kissed the devil's second face, that he had flown to meet the devil on several occasions on a broom, and that he had lied about the whole thing and said that witches couldn't exist, also to sexually satisfy himself. He repented and was allowed to live the rest of his life in prison, and this is the first instance that a broom is mentioned in connection to witches. The origin of the pointed witch hat isn't really known today, but may have come as an evolution of the dunce's cap that was used for humiliation, which itself was an evolution of the masks of shame from the plague times. Ointments, or as known at the time, unguents, were said to be made from corpses and other natural items, and could be used in many different kinds of witchcraft, including making the old young again, flight, teleportation, and gaining forbidden knowledge. A confession involving unguents from an accused woman can be found in a transcript from a court led by Kramer himself. It reads as follows: "This is the manner of it. We set our snares chiefly for unbaptized children, and even for those that have been baptized, especially when they have not been protected by the sign of the cross and prayers. And with our spells we kill them in their cradles by their parents' side, in such a way that they afterwards are thought to have just been overlain or to have died some other natural death. Then we secretly take them from their graves, and cook them in a cauldron, until the whole flesh comes away from the bones to make a soup which may be easily drunk. Of the more solid matter, we make unguents, which is of virtue to help us in our arts and pleasures and our transportations. And with the liquid we fill a flask of skin. Whoever drinks from which, with the addition of a few other ceremonies, immediately acquires much knowledge and becomes a leader in our sect." At this, Heinrich Kramer burned her alive. Along with these mystical objects, courts would also focus on the naked bodies of witches as well, and would look for 2 major signifiers that were said to be proof of a witch's mark and the devil's mark. A witch's mark was a third nipple hidden somewhere on the body that was said to be used to feed a familiar, imps, or other minor demons, who were said to crave human blood. Fear of eventually being tried as a witch resulted in most women cutting warts, moles, and lumps off of their bodies, so that they would not be confused as witch marks. This did not help though, as frequently the scars that would result from doing this would be used as evidence in court as a woman trying to hide her mark. Along with this, the devil's mark was a spot left on the body where the devil claimed a woman as his witch, usually done by raking his claws across her skin or licking her. Total inspections of the nude body were done with accused witches to find any evidence of the devil's touch. This included looking under the tongue, eyelids, and inside of the vagina. If the devil's mark was not found, pins would be inserted over the entire body until an area was found that did not cause the woman to flinch, meaning that she had scar tissue there that was probably caused by the devil's claws. And for me, all of this begs the question of, why women? Why were only 20% of the people burned at the stake in the 1500s men? Why were so many more women burned alive for centuries if both men and women were capable of being witches in the church's opinion? And why do we still today think of witches, especially Christian witches, as women? This is a complicated question, but basically the answer is that Heinrich Kramer just decided that witches were women when writing the Malleus, because it is clear from reading his work the extreme vitriol the man had against women, and that he wanted the book to pose as an instruction manual on how to lead a crusade of destruction against as many women as possible. I would love to know more about the psychology behind Kramer, but really all we have to go off of is his time in Innsbruck and some of his later writings. And I wonder how much of the events around the trial of Helena Schuberin played into the mindset of the text when he wrote it. For one reason or another, it is evident that he hated women strongly, more so than what was common at the time. He was seen as being overwhelmingly sexist in a time period that was known for being overwhelmingly sexist. He makes this very clear in 2 chapters titled, "Why is it that women are chiefly addicted to evil superstitions?" and "Why superstition is chiefly found in women," which I think probably caused the most long-term damage to the course of human history than any of the chapters in his book. His main argument is that if a carnal act of sexual penance to the devil is required to become a witch, then obviously more women would be likely to succumb to the sexual temptations of the devil than men. But he was one of the people who made up the idea that having sex with the devil was necessary to become a witch. And with that, he also made it legal to punish homosexuality as well as women during his crusade. He blames midwives as being the most susceptible to the allures of evil, saying that they surpass all others in wickedness. And what he's doing here ties in directly with the objective of the transition of the time period. As I said, women filled the position of medicine workers in many communities. Old women had been seen as knowledgeable in these things, and what Kramer is doing here is figuring out a way for the church to move into the daily lives of communities further, to take greater power than they already had. For a lot of people, when they think of the word doctor, they think of a man, and that is cemented right here with this sentence. Because each chapter is methodically based around taking an aspect of society that women had some position in, and restricting their freedoms and social standings to the point of making it acceptable to kill them en masse. He systematically tries to prove that women are weaker than men, calling them the fairer sex, but also saying that they have deeper capacities in all aspects of life than men, and that is why they should be controlled, as to protect the human race. He says in one part that women have no moderation in goodness or in vice, and when they are governed by a good spirit, they are the most excellent in virtue, but when they are governed by an evil spirit, they indulge the worst possible vices. And in another part that the lust of men leads them into one sin, but the lust of women lead them into all sins. And the reason he does this is so that he can be as harmful as possible, while also not contradicting Christian theology. Because by the logic that he creates here, witches can exist in the same theological space as the Virgin Mary, with one representing ultimate wickedness and the other ultimate virtue. He is creating new theology here using logic based in old theology to do so. And he finishes his arguments in these 2 chapters by saying that the reason witches need to be hunted to extinction is because the nature of women makes it more likely for witches to grow into great numbers if nothing is done about them. He says that they have slippery tongues and are unable to conceal from the fellow women those things which by evil arts they know, and since they are weak, they find an easy and secret manner of vindicating themselves by witchcraft. In which he means simply that women can't help but gossip to each other about everything, so naturally they couldn't help but share what the devil told them in secret. And by that logic, pretty soon every woman in the world would be a witch, with this evil knowledge that they share together if nothing was done about it. And thus, witch hunts were the only rational option to fight this. And also by saying this, Kramer vilifies the very act of a woman having friends, making it suspicious for one woman to talk to another about anything because of the way that it could have been perceived, making an opposition to his ideas and new theology impossible to ever form. Everything he does is to make sure that counter-arguments to what he suggests could potentially be punishable by death. By the time of the Protestants in the early 1500s, the witch crisis was in full motion, and they adopted the Malleus as their guidebook for their own trials as well. In 1522, Martin Luther called witches the devil's whores, and complained that lawyers looked for too much evidence and spent too much time deliberating before deciding on convictions. This was also the time that Nostradamus rose to popularity within European societies, particularly in Italy, and it is kind of interesting to see how he skirted being burned alive for decades, because he was reportedly very scared his entire life of the Inquisition coming after him for heresy. To avoid this, he sided with the church as often as he could, and with this he was at least publicly very against the Protestant Reformation and used his popularity to voice concerns of things that went against the views of the Catholic Church. It also helped that by this point, prophecy and astrology were only seen as being connected to magic instead of being outright practices of magic. It was rumored that in private, Nostradamus did attempt other types of magic such as necromancy, or was at least interested in it. But publicly he only presented himself as a seer, which was technically not illegal in some areas, but only technically. So the church never really went after him, but he also was really lucky that that didn't happen. And if his books had not been as popular as they were with the general public, then he probably would have gained more attention from inquisitors. With the larger scope of the trials, the witch purges also helped to see the early birth of capitalism. As trials grew in number, new jobs were created to facilitate the courts that would be paid from the seized assets of the accused. Land was confiscated from all who were put to trial and gifted to lawyers and judges for their efforts in tirelessly working on cases. Bookkeepers, judges, lawyers, jailers, cart drivers, and witch collectors were just some of the jobs that became high in demand as the late purges in Europe became less about religious values and more about business and economics. And the trials that followed the Malleus Maleficarum directly grew in their barbaric nature, as torture was advocated in many sections of the book to gain confessions. The trials would begin if a woman accused of being a witch was held in prison for a year without confessing voluntarily. She would be taken to court in a witch cart, which was a form of both spectacle and humiliation. She would be naked so that she could not hide any of the devil's tools on her person. She would often be shaven, as hair was believed to be tied to a witch's use of magic. She would have to walk into a room backwards, as a form of safeguard against evil for the members of the court, and would be whipped or beaten if she made eye contact with anyone during the trial. Judges would be surrounded by salt and sacraments, which stood as another form of protection from the devil clouding his judgment. Trials consisted of 3 rounds of torture, per the suggestion of the Malleus Maleficarum, and it was uncommon for anyone to go past the 2nd round without confessing to have relations with the devil. It was common for those who did to die before the 3rd round was over. Judges were permitted to lie to the accused, promising them mercy that would never actually be delivered if they confessed. The argument for this was that it was done for the best interest of society and the state. One of the accounts of a witch trial reads as follows. The torturer made her sit on the rack, undressed her, and applied the thumbscrews. When the thumbscrews were applied to her toes, she cried out louder than before. The inquisitor inserted the mouth pair and demanded that she confess. When it was removed, she told her story. 10 years ago it happened that the devil came to her in the guise of a man. First they danced, and then they dined, and then she knelt before the goat and kissed him. Here she named 8 of her neighbors. The conditions of the time were so inhumane that death was a welcome embrace, as opposed to what awaited these women at their trials. One letter from a woman named Rebecca reads, "O husband, they take me from thee by force. How can God suffer it? My heart is nearly broken. Alas, alas, my poor dear children, orphaned. Husband, send me something that I might die, or I might expire under torture. If thou canst not today, do it tomorrow. Write to me directly. Signed, R.M." 2 entire villages on the outskirts of Trier were exterminated. In another nearby, all but 2 were burned alive. The rampage spread across all of mainland Europe, and the fires raged wherever the Inquisition could be found. And the most frustrating thing about the Malleus Maleficarum for me is that the Catholic Church eventually rejected the ideas presented in it 3 years after it was published and had become a sensation. The University of Cologne, where the Inquisition was conceived, said that the Malleus Maleficarum's views on demonology were inaccurate. But it was all too late. Kramer's words were so sensationalist in nature that the book spread anyways despite that, with the help of several lies that he told. The largest such one was that he co-authored the Malleus with a man named Jacob Sprenger, who was dead at the time that he made this claim, who was an Austrian priest. that was well respected and named in another of Pope Innocent VIII's papal bull addresses. There is no actual hard evidence that Springer had any involvement with the text at all, and the common idea is that Kramer put his name on the cover after Springer had died to legitimize the work to get more people to read it. And it was even reported that in his life, Springer was actually vehemently opposed to Kramer's fringe ideas of witchcraft and women, and tried to make Kramer's work unsuccessful, cumbersome, and difficult when he could manage. But still today, if you find a new copy of the Malleus Maleficarum in a store, it will have Jacob Springer's name on the cover. Kramer also fraudulently published that the University of Cologne supported his ideas on witchcraft, even though the opposite was true. Witchcraft in England was treated very differently than the rest of Europe, as during the last century or so when all of this was going on, magic in England was treated as a civil crime and could not in most cases be punished by death, until the rule of James I in 1603. In the lead up to his rule in 1542, Henry VIII created the Witchcraft Act that called for the death and forfeiture of land to anyone found guilty of conjuring spirits or casting malicious spells. There exists on record only one case of this going to trial under this act, and the accused was pardoned by the next king, Edward VI, before the death sentence could be carried out. He also repealed the law soon after. About 20 years after this, after facing pressures from those in the religious community, Elizabeth I created the Second Witchcraft Act. This was done out of a public outrage over an unknown disease that had spread through England and Ireland, that caused cattle to go blind, with a great many people at the time suspecting witches to be the cause, referring to them commonly as eye biters. The act stated that death was to be the punishment for murder via witchcraft and for blinding cattle, with imprisonment and fines being used for lesser uses of magic, seizure of property and land for second offenders, and those attempting to murder via witchcraft or to attempt to blind cattle via magic, as well as those found guilty of using love potions. But when James I took over in 1603, he repealed Elizabeth's act and placed in his own that called for the death of anyone found guilty of any form of witchcraft on their first offense, which started England's witch hysteria about 100 years after the rest of Europe. Witch hunters began to be treated like major celebrities, and people like the self-proclaimed witchfinder General Matthew Hopkins and his colleague John Stern hung over 300 women accused of witches in just one of their short 3-year campaigns. Witch hunting in England did not peak until the 1640s, but lasted until 1736, when James's Witchcraft Act would be repealed, making Shakespeare's Weird Sisters from Macbeth in 1611 a commentary on the rising fear of witches within his country, as well as Europe's previous treatment towards witches. Women and men convicted of witches were not burned in England typically and were instead hung in most instances, as the Malleus Maleficarum never really took off in that area, and wasn't even translated into English until about 100 years after it was written, because the English had their own demonologists, such as John Cotta, Richard Baldwin, Thomas Potts, and William Perkins, who did not advocate for the burning of witches. Ireland was the only country in Europe that did not fall into the witch hysteria, and only had 8 trials for witchcraft between the years 1324 and 1711. Over the 400 years that the witch purges raged, it is estimated that several hundreds of thousands of people were executed for being suspected witches or conspirators with witches. I know I already said that, but it bears repeating. The purge eventually spread throughout Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, and to the New World, before finally dying out in the late 1700s, with most executions of people being accused of witches ending in the early to mid 1800s. It's a lot more complicated than that, with different individual movements, periods, and people involved. The Salem witch trials were a thing. But for our purposes, it is suffice to say that there were 400 years of needless, near-constant bloodshed over accusations of witchcraft and devil work. And it wasn't until the mid-1800s before people felt safe to actually critique in the form of art and literature the long history of cruelty that had spread the world over. So come back next time, and we're going to see what they had to say.